I want to speak about endings and new beginnings, and I want to begin with a quote from Lao Tzu, who wrote, "Beginnings are often disguised as painful endings." And the theme of what I'm going to talk about is really we can learn from and grow from any ending. We're always at choice. And I read an article this week by a lady named Josie Thompson. And she started the article by asking a question. And the question she asked was, what is the best time to figure out who you are and what you want? What is the best time to figure out who you are and what you want? And she answered the question by saying, right after a chapter in your life has closed. And I think what she means is when we have an ending, we need to take some time and figure out, where do I want to go from here? And so in that process, we need to figure out, who am I and what do I want? And when we do that, one of the words you can hear a lot this morning is choice. And when we do that, we get the choice to be better or to be bitter. To be better or bitter. And that choice is ours. But what's really important is that we leave the past in the past, because an ending isn't an ending to everything. We can still have a really great and wonderful life. An ending is really the beginning of a new day. And Ernest Holmes, who founded the Church of Religious Science, he wrote about Jesus and what Jesus meant in Matthew 9 when he talked about no man putting a piece of old cloth on a new garment or putting new wine in an old wineskin. And the reason why they used to do that in Jesus' day, because they couldn't afford new clothes, so they would patch him up. But if you put a new patch on an old garment, it would slowly but surely come apart. And if you put new wine in old wineskins, they generally will explode, or something like that will happen, and you lose all of the wine, like I did yesterday. We went out yesterday, and we bought a bottle of vodka to watch the Super Bowl today, and instead of twisting, it had a cork. And I opened it to try it and put it in the freezer, and a little bit later Becky said to me, "You didn't put the cork in all the way," and guess what leaked? And so we had to have another trip. Anyway, but you learn that lesson pretty quickly. And what Holmes said Jesus was talking about was he was teaching us about a religious development. He was saying we're always living a new life. And so when the past doesn't fit well with the present, we need to let go of the past so we can have a new beginning. And he said, our soul is always on a path of endless, expanding experience. And he wrote, there's no limit to the possibility inherent in all men. So I want to tell you a parable that'll, I hope, bring the point out some more. The angel of death comes to visit a person who was known as a very saintly person. And so God tells the angel of death, grant any one wish that this saint has. Whatever he wants, do it. And so this man's wish is that the angel of death be retired so people can live in peace, and that there would be no change in the earth. And so it comes to pass. And the earth comes to a halt. Seeds can't come out of their skin, so there's no new growth. And clouds can't let go of their moisture, so everything starts to become parched. and day can't give way to night, so there's constant hot daytime. And the people become hollow-eyed and frantic. And they start to realize that there's an agony in changelessness. And they just become frantic, as does the saint. And what he realizes is that attachment to the past doesn't allow the fullness of creativity to blossom, and that on some level, death is the mother of all newness and of all creativity. And so he goes and he begs God to undo his last wish, which happens. And what he learns is that change can be our greatest guide to ourselves becoming the wisest and most compassionate that we can be. So I know a lot of you have read and know about Joe Dispenza, and he was in the movie a couple of years ago. And in one of his books, he talks about this, about endings and beginnings, and holding on to what we want to see manifest in our life. And he says that greatness is holding on to a dream regardless of our environment. That it's possible that we can think greater than our present reality. We can think more than our present reality. And he said, take a look at Martin Luther King Jr., or on Gandhi, or on Marie Curie. They all did that. He said they all had a concept of a future reality. They had a vision for themselves. They had a dream that was greater than they were. And even though in the present they couldn't see it, feel it, taste it, or touch it, they held on to it, and they acted as if it was real. They acted as if it was real. And in religious science, we call that a mental equivalent, that in our minds, whatever it is we want to manifest, we put a mental equivalent in here and see it, feel it, touch it, however we can bring it to life. The more we can bring it to life, the more quickly it'll come into manifesting in our life. So I want to read you a quote that Dispenza had. He said, when our behaviors match our intentions, when our actions are equal to our thoughts, when our minds and bodies are working together, when our words and our deeds are aligned, there is an immense power behind any individual. And so he's, saying when we align everything, our thoughts, our beliefs, when we live it, we have immense power because the universe is working through us. And Wayne Dyer kind of picks up on this point that I'm trying to make, and he quotes James Allen, who said, we do not attract that which we want, but that which we are. And Dyer goes on and he says, who we are is determined by our beliefs. It's not determined by our DNA. When we change our beliefs, we change who we are. And what we focus on, whatever we focus on, that's the energy that we bring into our life. So I want to give you an example. A fellow named David Irvine wrote a chapter in a book I read this week, and he talks about how he travels a lot in his job. So he's always on the road, and he's disgusted with travel conditions in the airlines. So one day he's on an airplane, and they serve a meal which he's not too happy with. And he's about to turn to his seatmate, who's a woman, and kind of unload on her about, isn't this horrible? And before he could do it, this woman is so upbeat and so cheerful, she turns to him and she says, isn't it really nice how terrific these flight attendants are to us? And isn't this a really nice meal? And he turns to her and he said, how could you be so upbeat in a world that's so marginal? And she looks at him and she said, I was born in Sarajevo. I've seen friends and family killed right before my eyes. I don't let a poor meal bother me. I don't let delayed flights bother me. Since I've come to this country, there are no bad days. She said, there aren't bad days anymore, only bad thoughts. You know, we can't control events in our lives, all of the events in our lives, but we can control how we respond to them. We can see loss, or we can see an opportunity. And you know, for most of us, I would guess when you hear the term a door closes, it can sound like that must have been a sad time or a painful time. But if we believe that everything happens for a reason, it doesn't have to be a sad or a painful time. It could be a joyous time for new opportunities to blossom in our life. And Ernest Holmes wrote, no matter what confusion is at the center of your life, there is always a place of peace at the center of your being. Beneath the surface, there is always changeless peace. We can always go within, no matter what's showing in our life. Oh, I just thought of this now. We were in Publix yesterday, and I was getting some cold cuts, and the line was unbelievably long. And there was a family there, a woman and I don't know how many kids, and this woman was just talking so loud and yelling at these kids. It was so unpleasant. Becky was going nuts. And a guy there, a man there, called me over, and he said, I know I shouldn't say this, but that kid's going to grow up just like her mother, and nobody will want to be near either of them. So that'll give you an idea of what it was like being in Publix. And I was really, and they were also ordering one thing after another, so the line wasn't moving. And talking about there's always a place of peace. I try to meditate every morning for an hour. And finally, when I could really feel it getting to me, I just turned to Becky and I whispered, I ran for a half hour today, I prayed, and I meditated for an hour. This isn't getting to me. So, a fellow named Mike Goncalves, I'm not exactly sure how to say his name, he wrote about this idea about creating our future and what it could be. And so I want to give you some of the key points that he had in his article. He said, the first thing is, our future is what we decide it will be. We get the choice, again, to concentrate on what we can control or what we can't control. That's up to us. And he said, we create the future by what we do today. And I've talked about this before. He said, you shouldn't be surprised by your future. If you want to know what life's going to be like 6 months out or 8 or 10 or whatever, look at what you're putting your attention on today, because that's what you're going to manifest in the future. And the third and fourth point he made, the third point was, we don't get the future we wish for. We get the future we work for. And his fourth point was, so take the first step now. And I've talked about this before. In fact, I talked about it in one of the talks that I gave in Heritage Isle. Ask yourself, suppose my dream isn't impossible. What's the first thing I would do? And then do it. Suppose my dream isn't impossible. what's the first thing I would do? And then do it. Lao Tzu, another thing he wrote was, when I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. So, what stops us when we have an ending of any kind? What is it that makes the next part, the future, so doubtful? And for a lot of us, it's fear. It's because we don't know what's going to be coming about, and that can be really fearful. So I want to talk about that for a minute. But I had an interesting experience this week. Have you ever read a book that you've read more than once, and then you pick it up again, and you turn to something and you say, I never saw that before? Well, I had that this week. I like Lama Surya Das, and one of his books, Becky and I have read it a ton of times, and I opened it up and I said, God, that's really interesting. I didn't know that was in this book. And what it is, it's a concept, a Buddhist concept called Chod, C-H-O-D. And Chod is a Tibetan word that means cutting through. And what the concept is, it's based on a simple premise that when we cut through our fears, it brings us to a place of freedom and peace of mind. So how it works is somebody that's going to practice this goes to a place, either physically goes or in their mind, they go to a place, I'll give you a couple of examples, that is really fearful to them, and where their fears will be exacerbated, and they're going to be pushed to the limit, and they go through it to go to the other side. And a lot of times it's done at night. And so Surya Das gives an example in his own life. He said the cemeteries in Asia are really scary places. At nighttime they have jackals and coyotes and snakes and spiders. And what they do is, and what he's done, is spend an entire night sitting on the ground, meditating in an Asian cemetery. And he said, every bone in your body says, let me get out of here. But when you don't, you can work your way through it. And he gave another example of a woman in New York City who was afraid of the subway. And so she only walked or took taxis or buses, but then she got a job offer where there was no getting around being on the subway. So on the Friday night, before she started the job on Monday, she decided she was going to ride the subway all weekend until she worked through that fear, and she did it. And she did it. And so it reminded me of a time that I didn't know the concept, but I did it too and worked through, and it really got me to a different place. So I'll share it. When I was in the School of Ministry, every term we had to do an internship at a church. And when I was a senior, going into my senior year, the president of the board of the church that Becky and I went to had a heart attack. And we went to visit him in the hospital. And as soon as we got in the elevator in the hospital, I turned to Becky and I said, my stomach is in a knot. I hate hospitals. And I said to her, Jesus, I'm going to be a minister. You do pastoral care. This is not going to be good. So I went to the minister at school that we had to go through for our internships. And I said, Phil, I don't want to do my last internship in a church. I want to do it in a hospital. And I explained why, and he said, I'll tell you what, if you can get a hospital to write you an internship, you can do it. And I went to Mission Viejo Hospital, which is a stage 1 trauma hospital. And the head chaplain was a nun. And when I saw her, I figured, oh, religious science, a nun, this isn't going to work. And she was fabulous. She said, yep. And so I did a 10-week internship every Friday night from, I think, 6 o'clock at night to 10 at night in the hospital. And they assigned me to work with another fellow named Ron, who was a young guy, and he was Native American, and so I would shadow him. And I'll just tell you about two experiences that made such a difference. I went there one night, and when I walked in, I heard screams like I never heard in my life. I mean, to this day, I've never heard anybody scream in such pain as the person that was making this noise. And one of the nurses called me over, and she said, "That's a mother." And she's in that room, and she pointed it to me. She said, about an hour ago, she sent her daughter to the store to buy something. And her daughter, for whatever reason, was going like 90. Her car literally left the ground, and she not only hit a tree, she went through the branches, and she's dead. And that's her mother. And the nurse said to me, since the law in California is a body can't be left alone until the coroner comes to take it, and since you want to learn how to deal with death, we voted you're staying with the body, because none of the doctors and nurses wanted to do it. So I did. And I walked in to the room, and she was covered with a sheet. So I moved the sheet down to expose her face. And she still had the branches in her hair, believe it or not. And she had the trach piece in, and that's what her mother got to see. And I sat there with her for like almost 2 hours, just holding her hand and talking to her. And then the other experience I had, Ron said to me, "We're going to go into a room now, and you're going to see something like you've never seen." And I said, "What?" He said, "I'll let the person explain it to you." We walk in, and it's a very pretty young woman. She looked just like Linda Ronstadt. And she had pipes coming out of her head. She had steel coming out of both legs. Her arms, at least one of them, was in a cast. And she said, "You want to know what happened, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Drunk driver. I got drunk, and I wrapped my car up in Laguna Beach." And she was in incredible pain. And when we walked out of the room, Ron said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "I got it. I learned. It isn't death that bothers me," because I was sweating. I said, "I don't like to see people in pain." And he looked at me and he started to laugh. He said, "Well, you'd be a really crappy doctor, but I'll bet that's going to make you a good minister." But the point is, I might not have learned that if I wasn't willing to go through and practice going through a fear like that totally knotted up my stomach. So I want to close with one last example, and start with a quote from Rumi, who said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you. The wound is the place where the light enters you." And so I've talked about Rachel Remen before and how she works with people that have severe illnesses. And she writes in one of her books about this young fellow that she worked with. And he was a high school and college big-time star athlete. And he lost a leg due to cancer. And she wrote, before this, in college, he had all kinds of girls fawning over him. He had fast cars, recognition, and now it's all gone. And he wouldn't go back to school. He started to drink. He started to use drugs. And his coach sent him to Rachel Remen. And Rachel said he was in such a rage and so angry. He hated all people that were well. And in their first session, she gave him a piece of paper, and she said, "Draw me a picture of your body." And he drew a picture of a vase, and he took a black crayon, and he put a crack down the center of the vase, and he went like this so hard that he ripped the paper. That's the kind of rage that was in him. And she wrote that periodically he would bring a newspaper article in about somebody who lost a limb or about somebody who suffered terribly, and he would mock the helpers. He would say, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know how to deal with people like this. And so some of his doctors challenged him, and they said, if we don't know what we're doing, why don't you come and you speak to some of these people? So he did. And what they found was, a lot of them were young kids too, they really related to him, because here was a former star athlete, no leg, and he could speak their language. So one day he walks into a room, and there's a young woman in the room, and because of family circumstances, etc., she had had both breasts removed. And she was so depressed, she wouldn't even look at him. She wouldn't open up her eyes when he came into the room. So he started to joke with her, no response. Gets angry at her, no response. And there was music playing. She had a radio on and was playing soft rock. So he gets the idea to take off his prosthetic leg and to dance around the room. So he starts hopping around the room to the music. That gets her. She opens up her eyes and she starts to laugh, and she said, well, I guess if you can dance, I can sing. And they start to go out together to these kids' rooms, and now they're a team, and they marry. And on his last visit with Rachel Remen, she gets this intuitive hit to bring out the drawing that he did in the first session. And she gives it to him, and she said, now what do you think? And he said, it's not finished. Give me the crayons. So she gives him the box of crayons, and he takes out a yellow crayon, and he starts marking lines, yellow lines, radiating from that black strip where he had ripped it. So now he's got yellow lines radiating from it. And he looks at her and he said, this is where the light comes in. This is where the light comes in. And Rachel writes, suffering is intimately connected to wholeness. Suffering shapes the life force, sometimes into anger, sometimes into blame, sometimes into self-pity. Eventually, it may show us the freedom of loving and serving life. Thank you for being here. God bless you.